The gown was beyond saving. June knew it the moment she lifted it from the wooden chest. The silk that had once been the color of winter cream now hung in deliberate ruins. The hem slashed in 3 places, the left sleeve nearly torn from the bodice, and something dark and acrid staining the front panel in a way that no amount of rosewater would ever undo. She stood very still in the narrow alcove of her chamber, the dress suspended between her hands, and felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. She had suspected. She had told herself she was being uncharitable. She had been wrong to doubt her own instincts. The sound of her stepsister's laughter drifted up through the stone floor from the dressing salon below. Petra's high, sharp sound and Cecily's lower. Satisfied one, and June understood with perfect clarity that this had not been an accident. The gown had been locked in her chest. Only one other set of hands in this household held a key. She set the ruined silk down on the narrow bed and pressed her fingers flat against the cold stone wall. Outside the single window of her chamber, the last pale light of the afternoon was bleeding out of the sky above Ashvale, the capital city of the Iron Ridge Kingdom, and somewhere on the hill above the lower districts, the great torches of the royal keep were already being lit one by one in preparation for the night's event. She could see them from here. Small, distant flames like orange stars. The Alpha King's Ball. Once every 7 years, King Adrian of Iron Ridge opened his great hall to every house of standing in the kingdom, every pack with noble blood, every Omega of eligible age presented by her family, in the hope of a favorable glance. A dance. Perhaps a word exchange that might shift the fortunes of an entire bloodline. June's late father, Lord Emmerich Ashwood, had spent the last 2 years of his life ensuring that his youngest daughter would attend. He had commissioned the gown himself. He had written her name into the registry of presented Omegas with his own hand before the illness took him. He had died believing she would go. He had not accounted for what his widow, Lady Renata Ashwood, and the 2 daughters she brought into his house would do with his wishes once he was in the ground. June's fingers curled against the stone. She breathed in slowly. Cold air, wood smoke from the floor below, the faint sweetness of the dried lavender she kept in a sachet beneath her pillow, because it was the last thing that still smelled like her father's study. She breathed out. She was 23 years old. She was the legitimate daughter of Lord Emmerich Ashwood, of the Silver Hollow Pack, an Omega without a wolf. Her inner animal had never surfaced, silenced by the same fever that had nearly killed her at 15. And she had lived in this house as something between a ghost and a servant for the 3 years since her father's death. She was not supposed to be angry. She was supposed to be grateful that Lady Renata kept her fed and housed and did not cast her into the streets. She picked up the ruined gown again. She turned it in her hands. The slashes in the hem were clean, done with good shears, not torn in haste. Deliberate, careful. Done by someone who wanted it to look like wear rather than sabotage. Something shifted in June's chest. Not grief this time. Something harder. She had 4 hours. The seamstress in the lower market was an elderly Omega named Bess, who had known June's mother, and who owed Lord Emmerich a debt she had never been able to repay in his lifetime. When June appeared at the back door of her workroom with the ruined dress folded under her gray woolen cloak, Bess looked at the damage for a long, silent moment, then looked at June's face, then pressed her lips together and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent response June could have hoped for. "I cannot restore it," Bess said finally. "The silk is cut through. But I have something else." What she produced from the cedar chest at the back of her workroom was not the elaborate confection June had imagined wearing. No pearls, no embroidered panels, no silver thread caught in candlelight. It was simpler than that. A gown of deep gray-blue wool, fine enough to have once belonged to a noble house, with a fitted bodice laced in dark cord, and a skirt that fell cleanly to the floor. It had been made for a woman of June's height. It fit as though it had been waiting. "It belonged to your mother," Bess said, not looking at June's face. "She left it here for alterations the month before she died. I never had the heart to return it to your father." June stood very still in the center of the workroom, while Bess's arthritic fingers made 3 quick adjustments at the waist. "You have her coloring," Bess murmured. "The gold hair, The gray eyes. You'll do. June looked at herself in the small bronze mirror propped against the wall. She looked like someone who had been through something and had not been destroyed by it. She thought that would have to be enough. She braided her long blonde hair back from her face, pinned it simply, and drew her mother's cloak around her shoulders. She had no jewels. She had her name in the registry, her father's seal on the entry document tucked inside her bodice, and the particular quiet ferocity of a woman who has decided that she is done being diminished. She left for the keep on foot, alone, as the first stars appeared. The great hall of the royal keep smelled of pine resin and heated beeswax, of crushed herbs strewn across the stone floor, and the mingled scents of 100 pack nobles pressed into formal dress. Torchlight moved across tapestried walls, hunting scenes, battle maps. The silver sigil of the Iron Ridge crown repeated in thread above every arch. The musicians in the upper gallery were playing something formal and stately, and the crowd below moved in slow eddies of silk and wool and velvet. June stood at the far edge of the hall near one of the tall stone pillars and watched. She had been announced at the door, her name read from the registry by a herald who did not look up, and no one had turned to look. That was fine. She had not come here to be seen by the gathered nobility. She had come because her father had written her name into this moment, and she would not let it be taken from her, too. She was watching the dais at the far end of the hall, when Lady Renata appeared at her elbow. Her stepmother was dressed in deep burgundy, Petra and Cecily arranged behind her like ornaments, both in gowns of ivory and gold that June recognized with a distant, hollow feeling as fabric from the bolt her father had ordered for her trousseau. Renata looked at June's dress, her mother's dress, and something moved behind her pale eyes that was not quite surprise. "You shouldn't be here," Renata said quietly. The words were soft. They were not soft. "My name is in the registry," June said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Your name," Renata said, "can be removed. You have no wolf, no pack standing, no alliance value. You embarrass this house by appearing in another woman's cast-off." She glanced at the gown again, and June saw the precise moment her stepmother realized whose gown it was, the slight parting of her lips, the rapid recovery. "Leave before you make a scene." "I will leave," June said, "when I choose to." It was the first time in 3 years she had said anything of the kind, and the sound of it surprised even her. Renata's eyes went cold. Whatever she might have said next was swallowed by a shift in the room's sound. The music stopping, the crowd stilling, the herald's voice rising above the sudden silence with a single announcement. "His Majesty, King Adrian of Iron Ridge." The crowd parted. June turned without meaning to. He entered from the side passage rather than the main doors, which was itself unusual enough to draw every eye. No processional, no formal escort, just 4 members of the royal guard falling into position around him, as he moved into the hall with the unhurried authority of a man who has never needed ceremony to fill a room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black leather and dark wool rather than the ceremonial finery June had expected. His dark hair pulled back in long braids that fell past his shoulders. A single scar traced the line of his jaw. His eyes, catching the torchlight as he turned, were a pale, startling blue, the color of ice over deep water. He was not smiling. He was not performing. He moved through the gathered crowd with the contained stillness of something that could, if it chose to, be very dangerous indeed. June looked away. She had not come here for the king. She had come here for herself. She was still looking at the far wall when she heard the footsteps stop. Close. Too close. She turned. King Adrian of Iron Ridge was standing 4 feet away from her. Those pale blue eyes fixed on her face with an attention so complete it felt like pressure, and the entire hall had gone so quiet that June could hear the torches breathing. "You," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, simply, as though completing a thought he had been having before he entered the room, "are the one I want to dance with first." The silence in the hall lasted exactly long enough to become excruciating. June felt it press against her from all sides, the weight of 200 pairs of eyes, the held breath of every noble family who had spent weeks preparing their daughters for precisely this moment, the particular stillness of people who cannot believe what they are witnessing. She felt Lady Renata's presence behind her like a cold hand at her back, and she felt, more acutely than anything else, the complete absurdity of her own position. Standing in her dead mother's gown, without jewels, without a wolf, without a single ally in this hall, being looked at by the Alpha King of Iron Ridge as though she were the only person in the room worth looking at. She did not curtsy immediately. She probably should have. But her body had forgotten how to perform automatic deference, and for 3 long seconds she simply looked back at him, at the pale blue eyes, the scar along his jaw, the absolute stillness of a man who was accustomed to waiting for the world to arrange itself around his will, and felt something in her chest pull tight, like a cord drawn too fast through a ring. Then she remembered herself. She dipped into a curtsy, not graceful, not practiced, but real. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice did not shake. She was obscurely proud of that. He extended his hand. He did not explain himself. He did not look around the room to acknowledge the reaction his words had produced. He simply waited, palm upward, with the patience of someone who had never had a request refused, and was not particularly concerned about whether this one would be the first. June looked at his hand. She thought about her father's name in the registry. She thought about the shears that had cut through her silk gown with such careful deliberation. She thought about 3 years of cold corridors and borrowed candles and meals taken alone in her chamber, while her stepmother's household laughed below. She placed her hand in his. He danced the way he moved, without performance, without excess, with the kind of controlled precision that came from a body that knew exactly what it was capable of. He kept appropriate distance. His hand at her back was light, present without being presumptuous. The musicians had recovered from their shock and were playing again. Something slower and more formal than what had come before, and the crowd had rearranged itself around the edges of the floor, with the particular energy of people pretending not to stare while staring with complete commitment. June kept her eyes at the level of his collarbone for the first several measures. It felt safer than looking up. "You arrived alone," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "From which house?" "Ashwood, Silver Hollow Pack." She paused. "My father was Lord Emmerich Ashwood. He passed 3 winters ago." Something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. "I knew of Emmerich Ashwood. He was a man of considerable honor." "He was," June said, and the simplicity of agreeing with that sentence in this context, in this hall, on this night, made her throat close briefly. She swallowed past it. "You have no escort," Adrian said. "My family is present." She did not gesture toward Renata. She did not need to. He turned them in a slow arc, and she caught a glimpse of her stepmother's face at the edge of the floor, the color of it, the controlled fury, the rapid calculation happening behind Renata's pale eyes. Beside her, Petra and Cecily stood motionless, their ivory gowns suddenly looking like exactly what they were, fabric taken from a dead man's plans for his living daughter. "Your gown," Adrian said, with the careful neutrality of someone choosing words precisely, "is not what most women wear to events of this kind." June looked up then. She could not help it. She found him already watching her, and the directness of it. No pretense, no social performance, just attention, was startling enough that she answered honestly before she could construct something more diplomatic. "My other gown was destroyed before I could wear it," she said. "This one belonged to my mother. I thought she would not have minded." A pause. His pale eyes moved across her face, reading something there that she wasn't certain she had meant to show. "No," he said quietly. "I imagine she would not have minded at all." The music drew toward its close. June became aware of the specific ache that had been living in her chest all evening, the exhaustion of having fought for the simple right to be present in a room where her name had already been written, the grief of the gown, the fury of it, the loneliness that had become so familiar. She had almost stopped noticing its weight. She became aware of it because, for a brief and bewildering moment, standing in the careful circle of this stranger's attention, she felt at ease slightly. That frightened her more than anything else that had happened tonight. When the music ended, she stepped back and curtsied again. He released her hand with the same unhurried deliberateness with which he had taken it. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said. Formal, correct. A door closing. He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly too long. "Stay close to the east wall," he said very quietly. "Do not accept wine from any servant you have not seen pour it yourself, and do not leave this hall alone." June blinked. Pardon?" But he had already turned to acknowledge the lord who was approaching with the determined expression of a man who had been waiting to speak with the king for considerably longer than this dance had taken, and June was left standing at the edge of the floor, with his words sitting in her chest like stones dropped into still water. "Stay close to the east wall. Do not accept wine from any servant you have not seen pour it yourself. Do not leave this hall alone." A warning. Specific. Quiet. Not for the room. For her. She did not understand it, but she felt the cold certainty of it move through her. The same instinct that had made her look twice at her locked chest. The same instinct she had spent years talking herself out of trusting. She moved toward the east wall. It was near the second hour of the evening when she saw Renata speak to the servant. She had been standing near one of the tall windows, watching the hall with the careful attention of someone who has learned to read rooms as a matter of survival, when she noticed her stepmother detach herself from a conversation near the dais and move with deliberate casualness toward a young male servant carrying a tray of goblets. The exchange was brief. A few words. A small motion of Renata's hand. Something pale passing between her fingers and the servant's. The servant turned. His eyes moved across the hall. Found June. He began to move toward her. June stood very still. The goblet on his tray caught the torchlight as he approached. Wine, deep red, perfectly ordinary. He was smiling. His voice, when he reached her, was pleasant and practiced. "Refreshment, my lady? Compliments of the house." June looked at the goblet. She thought about the shears. She thought about 3 years of small cruelties disguised as accidents. She thought about the specific way Renata's hand had moved. "Which house?" June asked. The servant blinked. "I beg your pardon, my lady? You said compliments of the house. Which house sends the compliment?" A fractional hesitation. Barely anything. Enough. "No, thank you," June said quietly. "I'm not thirsty." The servant withdrew. June watched him go, watched him pass through a side door, watched him not return to the main serving area. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. She pressed her back against the cold stone of the east wall and looked across the hall to where Renata stood and found her stepmother already looking back at her with an expression that was perfectly composed and completely empty of warmth. The face of a woman who had just watched one plan fail and was already constructing the next one. There was something in that wine. The thought arrived not as fear, but as the dull, terrible weight of understanding. Not a small discourtesy. Not jealousy over a gown. Something deliberate enough to bring to a royal hall, to execute in front of 200 witnesses who would never notice a servant offering a lady a drink. Something that had been planned. June's mind moved fast and cold. Her father's seal, the registry, his name, her name. The estate at Silver Hollow that had been managed by Renata for 3 years without accounting. The inheritance that June had never had the power to demand. She thought of all of it, and the picture assembled itself with a clarity that made her feel sick. She was not being made miserable. She was being removed. She was searching for the nearest exit, calculating routes, when she felt the shift in the air to her left. That particular stillness. That presence. And turned to find King Adrian standing beside her at the east wall, not looking at her, his pale blue gaze directed across the hall toward the side door through which the servant had disappeared. "You didn't drink it," he said. "No," June said, He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The man who carried that tray reports to your stepmother's household. He arrived here tonight without invitation, added to the serving staff by a document that carries your stepmother's seal and a forged countersignature from my steward." He paused. "We found the forgery an hour ago. I was looking for the target." June said nothing. The cold in her chest had spread outward to her fingertips. "The substance in that goblet," Adrian continued, in the same level, quiet voice, "is derived from nightshade root. In sufficient concentration, it produces symptoms that resemble sudden illness in Omegas without wolf resilience." A pause that felt like the space before a door closes. "It is rarely survivable." The torches in the hall blurred briefly at the edges of June's vision. She blinked them back into focus. She would not faint. She refused to faint. "She tried to kill me," June said. The words came out entirely flat, stripped of everything except their meaning. "Yes," Adrian said, simply plainly, like a man who does not soften truth because he respects the person receiving it. "She did." June stood against the cold stone of the east wall in her dead mother's gown, in the hall of the Alpha King, with 200 oblivious nobles between her and the door, and understood with complete and devastating clarity that the life she had endured for 3 years had not been cruelty born of dislike. It had been preparation. Every locked door, every reduced meal, every small indignity, groundwork laid for a woman who had always planned to reach the end of it with a goblet and an opportunity. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were no longer steady. Adrian turned to look at her then. She felt it before she saw it. That quality of attention, that complete and unhurried focus. "You are safe," he said. "You have my word." She wanted to tell him that those words meant very little to her at present. She wanted to tell him that she had trusted in the safety of the people who were supposed to love her and had spent 3 years learning what that trust cost. She wanted to say all of it. Instead, she pressed her lips together and nodded, once, because her voice had temporarily gone somewhere she could not reach it. He did not push. He did not demand a response. He simply remained where he was, between her and the hall, between her and whatever Renata might try next, and said nothing further. And June understood, in the way one understands things that are felt before they are thought, that this was what the difference between those two kinds of men actually felt like. Not words. Presence. The simple, immovable fact of it. They took Renata before the 3rd hour of the evening. June did not see it happen. Adrian had guided her, not by force, not with urgency, but with the quiet directness of someone who has made a decision and sees no reason to complicate it. Through a narrow side passage behind the east wall, into a small anteroom where 2 of his royal guards stood at attention and a single candle burned on an iron holder beside a wooden chair. He had told her to sit. He had told her she was not a prisoner. He had left her there with the guards and returned to the hall, and June had sat in the wooden chair in her mother's gown and listened to the distant sound of the music and tried to arrange her thoughts into something that resembled order. It was not going well. She kept returning to the goblet, the pleasant face of the servant, the casual, practiced way he had smiled, as though he had done this kind of thing before, or at least had been told it was simple. She kept returning to Renata's hand, the small motion, the thing that had passed between them. How long had that been planned? Not tonight. Tonight was opportunity, not origin. The plan had roots. The plan had been growing in the dark for a long time, fed by quiet patience and the assumption that June, wolfless and isolated and dependent, would never see it coming. She had almost not seen it coming. If the king had not said stay close to the east wall, if she had been standing anywhere else in that hall, if the servant had approached her in a crowd instead of in a moment of stillness, she might have accepted the goblet without thinking twice, because she was tired, because the evening had already cost her so much, because sometimes the body simply wants the ordinary comfort of wine and warmth and the pretense that the world is not arranged against it. The candle flame trembled in a draught from under the door. June pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed. When Adrian returned, he was not alone. Behind him came a man she did not know, older, lean, with the look of a scholar and the bearing of someone who served in an official capacity, carrying a sealed document. Adrian spoke to him briefly in a low voice, and the man withdrew. Then Adrian looked at June. "It is done," he said. "Lady Renata Ashwood has been detained. Her household staff are being held for questioning in the lower guard rooms. The servant who approached you has been taken into custody." June looked at him. "Petra and Cecily? Your stepsisters are being escorted to guest quarters. They will not be harmed." A pause. "We do not yet know the degree of their involvement." June thought about Petra's laughter floating up through the floor. She thought about the good shears, the clean cuts, the gown beyond saving. She thought about whether either of them had known what the goblet was meant to accomplish, or whether they had simply enjoyed the smaller cruelties without asking where the larger ones were leading. She was not certain which answer was worse. "What happens now?" she asked. Adrian settled into the chair across from her. Not the posture of a king at court. Not performance. Just a man sitting down after a long evening. He looked at her steadily. "Now we establish the full scope of what Lady Renata has been doing. Tonight's attempt does not stand alone. A woman does not bring poison to a royal hall on impulse." He paused. "I suspect, when my steward examines the Ashwood estate records, we will find that the damage to your inheritance is considerable." June closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she said, "She has been managing my father's estate for 3 years. There were supposed to be quarterly accounting reports sent to the Silver Hollow Pack Council. I was never shown them." "Were you aware of your father's full holdings?" "Enough of them." She had spent hours in her father's study as a child, watching him work, listening to him explain the responsibility of land and name. He had never spoken to her as though those things would not eventually be hers. He had timber rights in the Northern Valley, wool contracts with 2 lowland packs, a significant store of silver in the estate vault, and a formal alliance agreement with the Greywood Pack that carried trading privileges. She stopped. "I have not seen evidence of any of those things in 3 years. Not a single delivery, not a single rider from Greywood, not a ledger page." Adrian was watching her with an expression she could not fully read. Attention, calculation, something beneath both that she was not yet prepared to examine. "Your father's seal," he said. "You mentioned a document." She reached into the front of her bodice and produced the folded entry document. The registry confirmation, Lord Emmerich's seal pressed in wax at the bottom, her name written in his hand. She held it out. Adrian took it, unfolded it, looked at it for a long moment. "This is his hand," he said, not a question. "Yes, he wrote it himself. He wanted—" She stopped, steadied. "He wanted me to attend this ball. He said it was important that I be seen, that my name be present in the record." She paused. "I think he knew he was dying, and he was trying to protect me from wherever he could still reach." Something moved across Adrian's face. It was brief and carefully contained, but it was there. "He was right to try," Adrian said quietly. He folded the document and held it out to her. She took it back and felt, absurdly, the sting of tears at the back of her eyes. She refused them permission. She stayed in the anteroom for another hour while the business of the evening was conducted around her. Servants brought her warm broth and bread, real food, not the formal decorative offerings of the banquet hall. And she ate it sitting by the candle because she had not eaten since midday, and her body had decided, with characteristic practicality, that the emotional weight of the evening could not be properly carried on an empty stomach. A guard came once to tell her that Renata had been formally charged under the king's seal with the attempted poisoning of a noble ward and forgery of a royal document. 2 charges. There would be more, June was certain, once the estate records were examined. She thought about what 3 years of isolation and controlled dependency looked like when reduced to formal charges in a court document. It seemed insufficient. It seemed, simultaneously, like more justice than she had believed she would ever see. She was still sitting with that thought when the door opened again, and Adrian returned, this time followed by an older woman in the gray robes of a royal healer, who looked at June with professional calm, and said that she would like to assess her for residual stress symptoms, which was apparently a medical way of asking if she was about to fall apart. June was not about to fall apart. She said so. The healer examined her hands, her pulse, the color of her eyes, with the methodical efficiency of someone who has seen many people insist they were fine immediately before being anything but. At the end of it, she said June was physically well, recommended sleep, and withdrew. Adrian remained. "You should rest," he said. "I've had a chamber prepared. You'll stay in the keep tonight." June looked at him. "I don't need—" Renata's household has been detained, but household loyalty is complicated. "I would prefer not to send you back to an empty estate in the dark with no protection." He said it flatly, without room for argument, but also without the edge of command, more like a man stating a practical fact to someone he believes is capable of evaluating it. June evaluated it. She thought about the empty house, the silent corridors, the chamber with the narrow window. "All right," she said. The chamber they gave her was on the upper floor of the keep's eastern wing, small by royal standards, but warm, with a fire already laid and burning in the stone hearth. A bed with a proper wooden frame and linen that smelled of dried lavender and cedar. A pitcher of water on the side table, and a window that looked out over the torchlit courtyard below. June stood at the window for a long time after the serving woman left, watching the guards change rotation in the yard, watching the last noble carriages roll out through the main gate, watching the evening fold itself into night. She should have felt relieved. The poison had not reached her. Renata was under guard. Her father's seal was in her hands. The worst of it, or at least the most immediate worst of it, had been stopped. What she felt instead was the strange, hollow exhaustion of a woman who has been braced for disaster for so long that the absence of it does not yet feel like safety, just a different kind of waiting. She had unbraided her hair and was sitting on the edge of the bed when the knock came. Light, measured. She said, "Come in," and the door opened, and it was Adrian, without the guards this time, carrying something draped over one arm. He stopped in the doorway, did not enter without permission, did not presume the space was his simply because the space was in his keep. "I wanted to give you this," he said, and held out what he was carrying. It was a cloak. Heavy wool, deep blue, lined with something soft. Royal quality without being ostentatious. It was warm by the simple evidence of looking at it. "You came here tonight without proper protection against the cold," he said. "The morning will be colder still." June looked at the cloak. She looked at him. "Why did you warn me?" she said. "At the ball, before you knew for certain. You told me to stay close to the east wall before your steward had confirmed anything. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. In the firelight, his features were less severe. Not softer exactly, but more human. The ice of his eyes warmed to something closer to gray. "Because," he said, "when you walked into that hall tonight, you smelled like someone who has been afraid for a very long time, and has learned to carry it so quietly that no one notices." He paused. "I noticed." June felt the words land in a place she had not known was unguarded. "That's a strange thing to say to someone you've just met," she said. "Yes," he agreed. He held the cloak out a fraction further. "Sleep, June Ashwood. Tomorrow there will be much to address. Tonight you are safe." She took the cloak. Her fingers brushed the edge of his hand, barely, accidentally, the way contact happens between two people standing closer than propriety requires, and neither of them stepping back. She felt it move through her like the draft that moves a candle flame. Sudden, small, impossible to ignore. She did not look up. He did not speak again. She heard the door close quietly behind him, and sat in the firelight with the heavy cloak across her lap, and her mother's gown still on her back, and understood that something had shifted tonight in a way she did not yet have words for, and was not at all certain she was ready to examine. Outside, the keep settled into its nighttime rhythms, the low exchange of guards, the distant sound of horses in the stable below, the wind off the northern hills pressing against the glass. June lay down in the lavender-scented dark, and for the first time in 3 years, slept without listening for sounds at the door. The estate records arrived by mid-morning. 3 ledger books, a collection of correspondence sealed with Renata's mark, and a separate bundle of documents that Adrian's steward, a precise gray-haired man named Oswin, spread across the long table in the keep's council chamber, with the careful hands of someone delivering evidence of something he found personally offensive. June stood at one end of the table in a clean linen gown that had been brought to her chamber before dawn, her blonde hair braided back, and looked at the scope of 3 years of methodical theft laid out in ink and parchment. It was worse than she had allowed herself to imagine. The timber rights had been sold 18 months ago to a merchant house in the southern lowlands. The documentation forged in June's name, her signature copied from a household receipt her father had kept. The wool contracts had been quietly voided and renegotiated under Renata's name alone. The silver in the estate vault had been withdrawn in 4 separate movements, each authorized by a document bearing a seal that was almost Lord Emmerich's. Almost, but not quite, the difference visible only when Oswin placed the forgery beside the genuine article and invited June to compare them. The Greywood Pack Alliance had been formally dissolved 8 months ago, again in June's name, in a letter she had never written. And at the bottom of the final ledger, in Renata's own careful hand, a figure. The total value of the Ashwood estate, calculated as though it were already fully liquidated, as though June were already gone. She stood at the table and looked at that number and felt the cold geometry of it. Not just theft, but planning. Not just cruelty, but patience. Renata had not hated her. Renata had simply looked at her and seen an obstacle with a timeline, and had been working through that timeline with the methodical focus of a woman who intended to reach the end of it. The goblet had been the end of it. The forgeries will hold up to a formal tribunal, Oswin said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for the opportunity to say exactly that. The signature discrepancies are significant enough that any council scribe will confirm them. The sale of the timber rights can be reversed. The merchant house acted in good faith, but the documentation was fraudulent and the law is clear. He paused. The silver is more complicated. We will need to trace the movements. It went to Petra's dowry negotiation, June said. She had not meant to say it aloud. But she had spent 3 years in that house watching money flow in one direction, and the patterns had assembled themselves into knowledge she had not known she possessed until now. There were riders from the Dawnfield pack last spring. Negotiations. Petra was to be presented as a match for the heir. The settlement would have required a substantial sum. Oswin looked at her. Then he looked at Adrian, who was standing at the far end of the table with his arms crossed, and his pale gaze moving across the documents with the focused quiet of a man who is building something in his mind. Verify it, Adrian said to Oswin, without looking up. Oswin made a note and withdrew. June looked at the spread of documents. She thought about her father sitting in his study, the smell of wood smoke and old parchment, his voice explaining responsibility and stewardship. She thought about the care he had taken to protect her, the registry, the seal, the gown he had commissioned. And she thought about how completely inadequate all of that care had been against a woman who had smiled at his bedside while he was dying and had been calculating the inventory of his estate before he was cold. My father trusted her, June said. It came out without heat. Just fact. Good men often trust badly, Adrian said. He said it without judgment, not of her father, not even of the failing itself, just an acknowledgement of how the world worked. It is not a weakness in the man. It is a talent in the deceiver. June looked at him across the length of the table. He met her gaze steadily. You knew what you were looking for before last night, she said. The forged counter-signature on the servant's document. That was not discovered in an hour. Someone had been watching Renata's household before the ball. A pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, but acknowledgement. Your father sent me a letter, Adrian said, 4 months before he died. June went very still. He wrote to me directly, under private seal, not through the usual channels of pack correspondence. He told me he was dying. that he had a daughter without a wolf who would be left in the care of a woman he had come to distrust, and that he feared what would happen to her inheritance and her safety once he was gone. He paused. He asked me to watch. The silence in the council chamber was complete except for the distant sound of wind against the high stone walls. He asked you, June said slowly, to watch over me. He asked me to watch over the situation. He was too honest a man to ask a king to involve himself in a domestic inheritance matter without cause. He said, Adrian stopped briefly, something moving behind his eyes. He reached into the breast of his tunic and produced a folded letter, worn at the creases, handled many times. He held it out across the table. June crossed to him and took it. The handwriting was her father's. She recognized it the way she recognized his voice in memory, the particular angle of the letters, the way he pressed too hard with the quill on words that mattered to him. She read it standing there, and the last paragraph undid her in a way that nothing else that morning had managed. She is braver than she knows, and kinder than this world deserves. She has no wolf, but she has something rarer. She sees clearly, and she does not look away from what she sees. Whatever becomes of my estate, please ensure that she survives long enough to become who she is meant to be. That is all I ask of you. June folded the letter along its old creases. She handed it back. She pressed her lips together and looked at the far wall, and gave herself exactly 5 seconds to feel the full weight of her father's voice speaking to her from across 3 years and the distance of death. Then she turned back to the table. What do we do about the alliance with Greywood? She asked. Her voice was steady. Adrian looked at her for a moment with that quality of attention, measuring something, she thought, or perhaps simply witnessing it. Then he moved to the table and pointed to the dissolved alliance document. We send a rider to the Greywood Pact today. The dissolution is fraudulent and therefore void. The alliance stands. He looked at her. But the formal reinstatement will require your signature, your real one, as the legitimate heir of the Ashwood estate. And Renata? She will face the tribunal within a fortnight. The charges are sufficient for permanent exile at minimum. A pause. There is also the matter of the poison itself. The apothecary we arrested this morning, the man who prepared it, has already given a full account in exchange for leniency. His testimony places the planning 4 months ago. Renata began preparation the same week your name was confirmed in the ball registry. 4 months. While June had been moving through her father's house like a ghost, eating at the margins of the table, sleeping in the narrow chamber, telling herself that this was simply how her life was now, Renata had been 4 months deep into a plan to end it. She wanted to ensure I never left that house, June said. Not just the estate, me. Yes. June picked up the quill from the table. She looked at the stack of documents that Oswin had flagged for her signature. The formal claim of inheritance, the reinstated alliance correspondence, the legal challenge to the fraudulent timber sale. A whole life in parchment, waiting to be reclaimed. She began to sign. By afternoon, the keep had shifted around her in a way she had not anticipated. Word moved fast in royal households. She had learned that in the single morning she had spent within these walls, and the story of the previous evening had assembled itself into something that traveled from the kitchens to the great hall to the upper corridors with the efficiency of a fire in dry grass. The Omega who had arrived alone. The dance. The goblet. The arrest. She was aware of being looked at differently than she had been the night before. It was not entirely comfortable. She was sitting in the keep's small library, having asked a servant for a room with books, and been brought here, to a high-ceilinged space smelling of old parchment and beeswax, with shelves from floor to ceiling, and a narrow window overlooking the inner courtyard, when the door opened, and Cecily came in. Not Petra. Cecily alone, without her sister's sharp confidence behind her, looking younger than June had ever seen her look. Her dark hair loose and her ivory gown from the previous evening replaced by a plain wool dress that might have belonged to anyone. June watched her stop in the doorway. I didn't know about the poison, Cecily said. No preamble. Her voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone who has been rehearsing a speech and has decided to abandon it. I want you to know that. I knew she hated you. I knew she was going to do something to make sure you couldn't attend the ball. The gown. She stopped. The gown was Petra's idea. I helped. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. June looked at her stepsister. She had shared a house with this woman for 5 years, 2 years of her father's marriage and 3 years after his death, and she had never once seen her look uncertain before. But you didn't know about the goblet, June said. No. Cecily met her eyes. I swear on my father's grave I didn't know. A pause. I know that doesn't fix anything. No, June agreed. It doesn't. Cecily nodded as though she had expected exactly that answer and had come here to receive it anyway, and withdrew. June sat with the quiet of the library for a long time after. She found Adrian in the courtyard at dusk, standing at the fence of the small training yard, where 2 of his guards were running drills with wooden practice swords. He was watching them with the focused patience of someone who sees both what is and what could be improved. And he did not look over when she approached, though she was certain he had heard her footsteps on the stone. Cecily came to see me, she said, stopping beside him. I know, I permitted it. He paused. I thought you deserved to hear it from her rather than read it in a tribunal report. June leaned against the fence beside him. Below them, the guards continued their drill. The rhythmic crack of wood on wood, the grunt of effort, the shuffle of boots on packed earth. The air smelled of cold stone and horse and wood smoke from the keep's kitchen fires. My father's estate, she said. Even if the inheritance is fully restored, I have no wolf, no pack standing of my own, no male relative to anchor the claim in council. Renata will have lawyers who argue that a wolfless Omega cannot hold a noble title uncontested. They will try that argument, Adrian said. They will lose it. She looked at him. How can you be certain? He turned from the training yard to look at her directly, and in the failing light of the evening, with the cold coming down off the hills and the torches just beginning to catch in the courtyard below, his pale eyes were the most awake thing in the landscape. Because the claim will be supported by the crown, he said. Because your father's letter sits in my private record, and his seal is on your registry document, and the law of this kingdom has never once required a wolf as proof of noble blood. He paused. And because I have been waiting 3 years for the moment when it would be appropriate to act on a dying man's request, and that moment is now. June looked at him for a long time. The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of pine from the forest beyond the walls. You could have acted sooner, she said. Not an accusation, a question. I could have, he said, and removed your agency entirely. Swept in while your father was barely in the ground and declared myself your protector, and made you a ward of the crown, dependent on my goodwill, no more free than you were under Renata's roof. His jaw tightened slightly. I chose to wait for a moment when you could act, when you could sign your own name, when the justice could belong to you, rather than to me. The guards below finished their drill. The courtyard went quiet. June felt something she had been holding very tightly, for a very long time, begin, just slightly, just at the edges, to loosen. That was, she said carefully, an unusually considered decision for someone with a great deal of power. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. I am occasionally capable of consideration, he said. June looked away before that almost smile could do anything further to the loosening thing in her chest. But she did not step back from the fence, and neither did he. The tribunal convened 12 days later in the great hall of the Iron Ridge Keep, and June sat at the claimant's table for the first time in her life, with her spine straight and her hands still, and her father's seal on the document in front of her, and watched Renata's legal proxy argue, with considerable skill and very little success, that a wolfless Omega could not hold noble title without a male guarantor. Oswin dismantled the argument in 4 minutes, using 3 separate citations from the kingdom's founding charter. Adrian said nothing at all. He did not need to. His presence at the head of the tribunal table said everything his voice would have, When the proxy attempted a second approach, citing the fraudulent dissolution documents as evidence of June's prior consent to the estate transfer, Adrian set his hand flat on the table and looked at the man with the particular quality of stillness that June had come to recognize as his version of a very final warning, and the proxy stopped speaking. The ruling took less than an hour. The Ashwood estate, including the timber rights, the wool contracts, and all holdings recorded in Lord Emmerich's original inventory, was restored to June Ashwood in full, as legitimate heir. The fraudulent documents were voided. The merchant house that had purchased the timber rights was to be compensated from Renata's personal holdings for the reversal of the sale. The silver withdrawn from the estate vault, traced, as June had predicted, to Petra's dowry negotiation, was to be returned in full within 30 days. Renata herself was brought in for formal sentencing at the end of the proceedings. She entered the hall between two royal guards, looking precisely as she always had. Composed, upright, her dark hair dressed with care, her expression revealing nothing. She looked at June once, across the length of the hall, and June looked back and felt nothing that she had expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter and more final than either. The sentence was permanent exile from Iron Ridge territory and all allied packlands, with forfeiture of all remaining personal holdings and the permanent revocation of any claim to the Ashwood name or estate. It was not a small sentence. It was not a light one. Renata received it without expression, turned when the guards indicated she should turn, and walked out of the great hall. June watched her go. She thought about the gown, the shears, the locked chest, the 4 months of preparation, the face of the servant carrying the goblet across the torchlit hall. She thought about all of it, and then she let it go. Not because it didn't matter, but because she refused to carry it any further than the door through which Renata had just walked. Petra had been questioned extensively and found to have known nothing of the poison plot. The tribunal accepted this, as the evidence supported it. She was released from the keep with a formal caution and escorted to distant relations in the Eastern Territories, the dowry negotiation permanently dissolved. Cecily, who had given voluntary testimony about the destruction of the gown and several other household incidents, was permitted to leave freely. June did not see her go. She had said what needed to be said in the library, and Cecily had heard it. It was enough. She rode to Silver Hollow 3 days after the tribunal, with a royal escort and Oswin beside her to oversee the formal transfer of household management. It was the first time she had made the journey in the opposite direction from what she was used to, not being taken somewhere, but returning. The road through the northern valley was silver with morning frost, the pine forest on either side standing dark and still, and the air tasted of cold and wood smoke, and beneath both, the particular green sharpness of the land her father had loved. The estate was smaller than memory had made it. The front garden was overgrown, the main gate's iron hinges rusted to a deep orange. Inside, the room smelled of dust and disuse, the furniture covered in linen sheets, the fireplaces cold. Renata had not lived here. She had managed it from Ashvale, from a distance, as a ledger entry rather than a home. June walked through the rooms alone, the escort waiting in the courtyard, Oswin occupied with the household staff and the inventory in the outer offices. She walked through her father's study last, and stood in the center of it, in the smell of old parchment and cold ash, and placed her hand flat on the surface of his desk. She did not cry. She had done that, privately, in the small hours of 2 different nights in the keep's eastern chamber, when the dark was complete enough to be honest in. There was nothing left to cry here. Just recognition. Just the particular homecoming of a woman who has survived the thing that was meant to prevent her from ever returning. She sat at her father's desk. She pulled the first ledger toward her and opened it. She began to work. Adrian came to Silver Hollow on the 7th day. She was in the garden when the rider arrived ahead of him, a royal messenger to announce the king's approach, which she gathered was proper protocol, and which struck her as slightly excessive, given that she had spent the last week eating at a kitchen table and personally rehanging 3 sets of window shutters that the estate's carpenter had been too occupied to address. She set down the pruning shears she had been using on the overgrown rose bushes along the south wall and went to the front gate. He arrived with a small escort, 4 guards, no ceremony, and dismounted at the gate with the same unhurried ease with which he did everything. He was in riding clothes rather than formal leather, a dark wool cloak over his shoulders, and he looked at the estate, the repaired hinges, the cleared garden path, the smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, with something in his expression that was close to approval. "You've been busy," he said. "There was a great deal to do," June said. She stepped back from the gate. "Come in." They walked the garden while the escort settled in the courtyard, the morning cold enough for their breath to show, the frost still holding in the shadow of the south wall. She told him about the estate, the inventory, the staff she was rebuilding, the first letter she had sent to the Greywood Pack steward that had already received a warm reply. She told him that the estate's old kennel master had returned, that the kitchen garden had more viable rootstock than she had expected, that her father's library was entirely intact because Renata had apparently found books neither valuable nor interesting. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, without the particular restlessness of someone waiting to speak. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. They had stopped near the old stone bench at the far end of the garden, the one that faced the valley view her father had always claimed was the best reason to own this particular piece of ground. It was a good view. Rolling hills going gray-gold in the winter light, the dark line of the pine forest at the edge of the valley, the sky above it a pale and enormous blue. "I should tell you something," Adrian said. June looked at him. "What I feel when I am near you," he said, with the same directness he applied to everything. No preamble, no performance, no shelter behind careful language, "is not something I am accustomed to feeling, and not something I intend to act on without your understanding of it." He paused. "You have been through something that would make any reasonable person distrust promises. I am not going to make you promises. But I wanted you to know that my interest in your welfare since the night of the ball has not been purely administrative." June stood in the cold garden in her father's land and looked at the man who had warned her about the east wall, who had held her father's letter for 3 years without using it as leverage, who had waited 12 days and a 3-hour ride to say this to her in a frost-covered garden, rather than in a council chamber where power meant something different. She thought about the mate bond, the concept she had grown up with, the thing that shifter culture spoke of as destiny and inevitability. She had spent the last 2 weeks aware of something in her chest that responded to his proximity in a way she did not fully control, a pull that was different from anything she had felt before. She had told herself it was gratitude. She had told herself it was the disorientation of safety after years of danger. She had told herself a great many things. She was very tired of telling herself things that were not entirely true. "I don't have a wolf," she said. "I have never shifted. I don't know what I am within the bond structure of your world. My world," Adrian said, "is also your world, and the bond does not require a shift to be real." His pale eyes were steady on hers. "I have known since the moment you walked into that hall. I was not going to tell you under duress, or in a council chamber, or before you had your own ground under your feet." June looked at the valley below, her father's valley, her valley now, and felt the cold air in her lungs and the solidity of the stone beneath her boots, and the strange, expansive feeling of a life that had just become entirely her own to direct. "I am not ready," she said, "to call it a bond. Not yet. The word has been complicated for me." "I know," he said simply, "but I am not—" She stopped, looked at him. "I am not unwilling to find out what it is, on my own terms, without a timeline." Something in his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but a settling, a rightness. The look of a man who has been patient for a long time and has just been told that the patience was not wasted. "On your terms," he said, "without a timeline." She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, and then he took it. Not the formal gesture of the ballroom, not the careful protocol of king and subject, Just two people standing in a cold garden choosing something together. They were married in the great hall of Iron Ridge the following spring. Not because it was required, not because the bond demanded it, not because the council pressed for a formal alliance, though it did. Because June Ashwood, standing in her own reclaimed garden on a frost-covered morning, had decided that she was done with half-measures and provisional lives and the performance of safety. Because she had spent a winter learning, slowly, in the careful increments that trust requires after it has been broken, that Adrian of Iron Ridge was precisely what he appeared to be. No more, no less. And in her experience that was rarer than any magic the world contained. The gown she wore was her own, commissioned by her own hand, paid for with her own restored inheritance, deep blue wool threaded with silver that caught the candlelight in the great hall, the way the first gown never could have. Her father's seal was not on a registry document this time. It was pressed into the wax of the marriage contract, placed there by June herself, the legitimate heir of the Ashwood estate, signing her own name in her own hand. Oswin wept during the ceremony. He denied it afterward with considerable vigor. The Greywood pack sent a delegation and a gift of fine linen. The Silver Hollow Estate's kennelmaster stood in the hall in his best coat, looking enormously proud of something he had not personally accomplished. Cecily was not present, and June had not expected her to be, and she found the absence neither painful nor satisfying, simply accurate. When Adrian placed his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with those pale, awake eyes, and said the words of the bond-sealing ceremony in the old language of the Packs, words she had heard once at her father's wedding, and never expected to hear spoken to her, June felt the thing in her chest that had been pulling tight since the night of the ball finally, completely, release. Not into nothing. Into something larger. Into the particular rightness of a woman who has been told all her life what she cannot have, standing in the center of the life she chose, with the man she chose, in the hall of the kingdom that is now also hers. She had come to the ball alone, in a dead woman's gown, with no jewels and no wolf, and nothing but her father's name in a registry. She left it a queen. And every person in that hall, every noble family, every pack lord, every council member who had watched her arrive without escort and dismissed her in the same breath, understood, in the absolute silence of the moment, Adrian's hand settled at her waist, and she looked up at him with gray eyes that had never once looked away from what they saw, that they had witnessed something they would tell their children about. Not a fairy story, not a rescue, a woman who had refused to be removed from the record of her own life, and who had written the rest of it herself. The torches burned. The great hall breathed. Outside, the spring night was warm and enormous and full of stars. And inside, June Ashwood, Queen of Iron Ridge, Luna of the Silver Hollow Pack, daughter of a good man who had loved her enough to ask a king to watch over her, laughed at something her husband said against her hair, and was, at last, completely and irreversibly home.